Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. My name is Scott Deitche. I'm a mob author, historian, mobologist, if you will. I've written a number of books on, on organized crime, articles, been researching the topic. About 25 years now.
Now, was it surprising to you, I guess, to learn maybe about organized crime? Like, was that an interest you had as a kid?
Well, I grew up in New Jersey and grew up right outside New York City. So I used to get the New York news a lot. My mom always loved the old Mafia movies. And, growing up my age, through the 80s is the era of Gotti. So it was on TV a lot. It was something I was aware of for sure. My paternal grandfather was a bookmaker when I was really, really young, before I was old enough to understand that. But really, it was in the early 90s, after seeing Goodfellas in the movie, I went and I bought the book Wise Guy by Nick Pileggi that it was based on, read that, and that kind of piqued my interest. So I read another book about the mob, and it kind of started snowballing from there. So
when it comes to certain mob individuals, I saw you talked a little bit about Trafficante, and like I told you a little bit off air, this name gets brought up a lot when you're studying the Kennedy assassination. So, I mean, how far did you go with the mob? Did you focus on certain individuals like Trafficante? Did you look into other relationships? I mean, I think it's surprising for a lot of people that the government and the mob work together at some point, which, I mean, that adds a whole historical thing to it as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I've had books on the history of the mob in Jersey and other general mafia topics, but my first two books really concentrate on the mafia in Tampa. And Santo Trafficante Jr. was the mafia boss in Tampa from early 50s through his death in 1987. And like you said, he found himself in the middle of some interesting kind of geopolitical things going on, especially in the post-Castro era.
Now, when it comes to Cuba, why was everyone so obsessed with Cuba?
So, taking a little bit of a step back, the United States in general has always, can't say always, at least starting in the late 1800s, had meddled in affairs of Cuba and their kind of strategic and business interests there. From an organized crime perspective, you really see the importance of Cuba starting during the Prohibition era. Havana is a major trading port, especially for ports in the south of the United States, Tampa included. Specifically with organized crime in Tampa, they were bringing in rum, corn, sugar, molasses out of Cuba through Port Tampa Bay. They were bringing in narcotics out of Havana through Port Tampa Bay. They were bringing in people, illegal immigrants, through Cuba into Tampa Bay. So there was always a very close connection there. And this continues on. And in the early 1950s, when Fulgencio Batista comes to power, you kind of get a couple things colliding there. You get the post-World War II tourism boom in Cuba, but now you have a friendly government who is letting mafioso like Trafficante, like the Manarino brothers from Pennsylvania, Meyer Lansky, buy and own and operate casinos and hotels. So for the mafia, this is their chance, kind of quasi go legit.
And they ended up getting kicked out of Cuba. The government did, and some of the mob figures did as well too. And I don't know if the relationship, I guess, between the government and the mob formed then, or there might have been something before, but that's when I start to notice this relationship and kind of the assassination plots against Castro. But this Trafficante figure is like, I mean, did you look into his personal life? Did you try and understand, how he even got involved? Was he born into the mob at all? Or was this, I mean, because I can say there's documents, man. I hate to bring it to the Kennedy assassination, but there's documents I see at Trafficante where I start questioning, is this guy a double agent? Like, it would just make more sense. I mean, there were 635 assassination attempts on Castro. Not a single one worked. And it was just like, I mean, he had to be getting, dude, explosive cigar that would have got me day one. I'm just saying. But there was like this weird kind of, and there's Roselli and there's Giancana and there's for my generation, I don't know who these people are. They're just names that sound they sound like they have a little bit of mustard on top of it. But I don't know who these people are. So it's like I'm curious on Trafficante's background, if you went into that at all, and then if you looked into any of those Castro dealings.
Oh yeah, absolutely. My second book, The Silent Dawn, is basically about Trafficante. And so he was born in 1914 in Tampa. His father, Santo Trafficante Sr., was born in Sicily. Um, in 1940, his father kind of took over the mafia in Tampa, Santo Trafficante Sr., and he kind of groomed Santo Jr. to take over for him. So Santo Trafficante Jr. is kind of brought up in the mob. He's kind of around a lot of mafioso. He's also around a lot of Cuban and Spanish gangsters in this neighborhood called Ybor City in Tampa, which is a really interesting multi-ethnic neighborhood that grew up predominantly because of the cigar industry in Tampa. So when it comes time to have someone in Cuba, the Tampa Mafia already have very close connections in Cuba. You have the Cuban cultural connections between Ybor City and Havana. And, Santo Trafficante, he could speak Spanish. He grew up around Cuban culture. He understands it. So he becomes pretty powerful figure in the casino industry. Now, what a lot of people don't know, and you might have read about something to this effect, is during this time that Castro is fighting with Batista for control of the Cuban government, the mob is supplying Castro with guns and money and stuff. And it's, from you look at it from a mob guy perspective, okay, we're going to play both sides, and whoever wins, we'll just work with them. And Castro takes over, and most of the wise guys leave except for Trafficante. He decides he wants to kind of wait it out and see how things kind of play out. Well, he eventually gets jailed by Castro in the spring of '59, and it's the only time that a Tampa Mafia boss has ever spent a night in any kind of jail, let alone an American jail. And from there, from the time that Trafficante is in Cuban prison onward, that's when you start getting into the kind of the more murky conspiratorial type links and ties.
Can I ask what some of those conspiratorial ties are?
Sure. So when he's in prison in Cuba, he's visited by one of his associates, a guy named Lauren Hall. Louis McWillie. Lauren Hall's there in prison with him. And Louis McWillie brings another guy to Havana after Castro takes over to go visit Trafficante, and that guy is Jack Ruby. So here, 4 years before Jack Ruby kills Lee Harvey Oswald, he's meeting with Trafficante in Cuba. And I had a chance to speak to Jerry Hemming, who's a soldier of kind of like a soldier of fortune, a mercenary type, before he passed. And he was in the same prison. And he says, yeah, absolutely. According to him, it's definite that Ruby visited Trafficante in prison. And even in the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee of Assassinations, they acknowledge that Jack Ruby is going to Cuba after Castro takes over. So Trafficante gets released from Cuban prison and he relocates to Miami. A lot of that had to do with law enforcement pressure in Tampa on him. And then he gets kind of roped into this whole thing that you alluded to, which are these CIA mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Now, was there a middleman that they had, that somebody that was an observer or someone that had to work together with, at least to facilitate communications? I would have to think that they kept it very secret that they were working with the mob. Hell, Hoover didn't even acknowledge the mob, which is just interesting because I never believed the conspiracy that they had him in a dress. I've seen the photos. I could show you the photos. I just still don't validate that. But what I do believe is more realistic is the fact that Hoover liked to go to the track and the mob kind of owned the track. I mean, the whole gambling aspect of things.
Yeah, that too. And Hoover went for quick wins and a lot of high profile wins, and certainly kind of starting from scratch to investigate this gigantic potential national empire of crime, might not have fit into what he was looking to do at that time. But you're getting back to your original question, was there a middleman? And yes, his name was Robert Mayhew. And for those of you viewers that are not familiar, Robert Mayhew worked for the FBI. He became kind of a political fixer, liaison with the CIA. And he later, more famously, went to work for Howard Hughes when Howard Hughes moved to Las Vegas and started buying up the casinos in Vegas. But Robert Mayhew, and I interviewed him a couple times before he passed away. He told me, he said he set up a meeting at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach with Sam Giancana, who is head of the Chicago mob, or the Chicago outfit as it's known, Johnny Roselli, who was a Chicago mobster who relocated out to Los Angeles and had a lot of interesting connections in the intelligence community, and Santo Trafficante. And he passed money from the CIA to Trafficante to kill Castro. Now, I could tell you there's a lot of wise guys that say that Trafficante never lifted a finger to go after Castro, and he just took the money that the CIA gave him and put it in his back pocket, which is, when you think about it, that's about the most wise guy thing you can possibly do. So yeah, that's where that whole genesis of the CIA mafia plots kind of start out of these meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel on Miami Beach.
Now, when it comes to the relationship between Giancana, other mob figures and Trafficante, it's not normal for a lot of these mob figures to be meeting together, right? Like, I think I've talked to a couple people who've worked on organized crime and talked about it, and it's varying. Some people believe that they had meetings all the time, and some people believe that they rarely ever had meetings. And the movies kind of show them sitting at tables and things of that sort. But I mean, is that normal? Did they have a pre-existing relationship before? I'm sure they're aware of each other.
Yeah, and there were smaller meetings like that. When you think about big meetings, you think about the Appalachian meeting in 1957, where every head of the mafia from around the country meets. That was rare, but certainly smaller meetings with especially when business interests align. But the interesting thing is in Miami at that time. So Miami, even though Santo Trafficante was boss of Tampa and controlled the west central part of Florida, Miami was considered an open city where mobsters from around the country can go. So almost every major mafia family had either their bosses would winter in Miami, or you had representatives in Miami. And Trafficante was meeting with a lot of them there. So there was probably more, especially back then in the 50s, 60s, more meetings with like one-on-one with other mob bosses or underbosses than you would think. But that giant thing with there's 100 guys in a room, that was a little bit more rare.
How did Trafficante feel after being locked up by Castro? Because you mentioned it. I mean, you alluded to kind of, I guess I'm not saying I'm putting words in your mouth, but I mean, first time mob guy's ever been locked up. I mean, that's what I see in some of these testimonies as well, too, is when I'm looking at some of these testimonies, you hear a mob guy say a bunch of things and the guy goes, "Oh, that was really good. We got a lot of info out of this guy, but that's the first time we've ever heard a mob guy give us a full breakdown and plan." So you could just take that evidence and chalk it out the window, because that doesn't happen. There was this idea, and it is that kind of stereotypical, I don't want to be a rat, or I don't want to you lose credibility in that aspect. And I think when you look at the mob, that's a lot of their decision making boils down to that aspect of, how is this going to make me look? I mean, if you're getting locked up by Castro, I mean, how many people heard about it? How many people knew about it? How many people that you might be in charge of know about it? I mean, I have to think that at this point, you're like, okay, let's get rid of this guy. Let's try and get our way back in Cuba.
So, yeah, everyone knew about it. It made the papers, and his family and other mob guys from Tampa, his lawyer, Frank Regano, were working to free him. So it's still kind of unclear exactly how he was freed. I think probably the most, there are a couple different theories that hold water. But anyway, he gets freed out of Cuban prison when he goes to Miami. Interestingly, when he comes to Miami and he starts getting involved in these anti-Castro plots and starts work with the CIA, there's also a lot of intel documents and FBI documents internally. There's a lot of rumors that Trafficante is also working with Castro, that he might be playing both sides. And the thing about this is, from a purely business perspective, when the mob was kicked out of Havana, Cuba, they lost a lot of money. Trafficante lost a lot of money. He owned 2 of the casinos. He had interests in a couple others. So he was maybe potentially looking at, again, ways to leverage as many angles as he could to get back into Cuba. You later see him try to get into other casinos throughout the Caribbean. And the other interesting thing, he's one of the few mafia guys that really didn't make a pivot to Las Vegas. He was really fixated on this, either getting back into Cuba or getting back into the Caribbean. So are we ever going to know for sure if he was a secret agent for Castro. Maybe there's some files buried in, in Havana somewhere that maybe shed more light on it. But he definitely seemed, or from Trafficante, seemed like the kind of guy who played a lot of different angles to try to, leverage himself and get what he wanted.
I'd ask your personal opinion on this, and I wouldn't really use the word conspiratorial. I'd probably say more controversial, because obviously everyone has their own idea of where that's going. But we know that there was a working relationship with the mob and the government trying to assassinate Castro. I honestly think he was playing both sides. I don't even go as far as saying an agent. I just say, I mean, strictly from a business aspect. Imagine if you can be the only mobster that's running your work out of Cuba and everyone else is kicked out. I mean, that sounds like a better deal. There's just so much about it. Like, I didn't know Giancana was the one that came up with the poison pill idea, where I was like, what is the IQ of this mobster? I'm asking questions, because I start going, that's an intelligence thing. I mean, they had character assassination to make Castro's beard fall out, but Trafficante had a guy, I think, that was supposed to be in Castro's circle, and then something happened and it never fully came to fruition or something like that. And I know I've seen documents of suspecting Trafficante playing both sides. And to me, that's just smart, but it's that mob mentality, not like a group, but a person, where it's like, this person did put me in jail. Even if he, like, trying to work with someone that does that to you, to me, that just seems like you got to burn the bridge.
Yeah, and I personally, in all the research I did, never saw any definitive evidence of Trafficante moving forward with a specific plot against Castro, which to me lends credence to some of this trying to work out a way to play both sides. The other interesting thing is, you mentioned how there was really a plot. He had people that were close to Castro, and the reason for that is, when Trafficante was when the Mafia, U.S. Mafia, was in Havana, there was Cuban-based organized crime figures that were also involved. And when Castro took over, a lot of those Cuban organized crime figures fled to Miami, but some stayed there. So Trafficante had connections, still had connections going back into Cuba. And an interesting postscript is, some of the Cuban mafioso that moved to Miami later also became involved in anti-Castro activities. In fact, there's a few people involved in the Bay of Pigs that were Cuban gangland figures that later, post Bay of Pigs, became pretty significant organized crime figures in Miami.
Did you come across anything about RFK and his whole, like, attack on the mob? I mean, I'm very rough in that area. I haven't stuck to the RFK topic. That's an assassination for another lifetime, I think.
Yeah.
But did they make any statements? Did you come across, like, what is your perspective on RFK and handling the mob?
Yeah. So, obviously Robert Kennedy went hard after the Mafia, specifically Jimmy Hoff and the Teamsters involvement, Carlos Marcello, who was the Mafia boss of New Orleans. So one of the prevailing theories behind the overarching theory that the Mafia had involvement in the assassination of John F. Kennedy was to ostensibly get Robert Kennedy off the back of the Mafia, get the Justice Department to back off. And if you look at investigations in the immediate aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, John Kennedy's assassination, you see that play out to some extent. But then, of course, by the early 70s, and you had Robert Blakely on your thing, things, their FBI going full force against the Mafia, not less than a decade later. So, but that's one of the kind of prevailing undercurrents. Now, in terms of the assassination of Robert Kennedy, yeah, I'm with you. That never really dovetailed into my work on Trafficante or any of the Mafia guys that I've written about. I think that's, like you said, maybe a different assassination for a different day.
I don't even know if I believe that the mob did it. I know that's Blakey's point of view, and I think that, but you would get so much hellfire on top of you from the government if it was true that way. I definitely probably believe more rogue elements, and obviously we don't have to go into the assassination on this aspect. But I'm trying to see where Trafficante, I mean, did he ever reach out to, or did he ever make a statement or anything about John F. Kennedy's death? I mean, I have to think you'd want to cover your ass a little bit.
No, he did. So there's a couple places where this occurred. One was in the immediate aftermath. There was a steakhouse in Tampa, Tropic Steakhouse, and I've talked to a couple people that were there when Trafficante and a couple of his guys literally toasted the death of John F. Kennedy. And certainly were celebrating it. But probably the most telling confession, if you will, in 1994, Frank Regano, who was Trafficante's long-term attorney, wrote a book called Mob Lawyer, and he says in the month preceding Trafficante's death in '87, he died undergoing heart surgery. Trafficante confessed to Frank Regano that him and Carlos Marcello had Kennedy killed. Now, it was a controversial statement, and I've talked to Regano's family who firmly believe it and firmly believe that Trafficante really said that. But that's a really he said, and they're both long gone kind of a situation with that. But there were some, I interviewed people that recall hearing Trafficante talk positively about the assassination. That certainly doesn't prove anything in terms of involvement. And just real quick, to me, who killed Kennedy is nowhere near as interesting as all the stuff around it. And I think that's where you really see a lot of the mafia involvement. But I don't think there's ever going to be kind of a smoking gun, if you will, on the depth of the mafia involvement in that.
What was Trafficante's actions after Kennedy? I mean, besides you kind of jumped to his death where he made a statement. I don't trust that, just because the same thing I don't trust James Files, who's in prison, talking about, he was the one that did it. But what was the mob doing? I mean, I have to feel like the media might have had a little bit more attention on a mob angle or anything like that. I mean, it doesn't even have to be JFK related. I just want to know what their actions were following, a historical event like that.
Yeah, and you don't see a lot of like major shifts and things. And the other interesting thing is '63, something else really important happens in organized crime in the mafia. You have Joseph Valachi's testimony. Joseph Valachi is not the first, but one of the first really big TV era turncoats on the mafia. And he really lays bare the inner workings of the mafia. And all of a sudden, now you have a lot more media attention, you have a lot more law enforcement attention on the mafia. So, whatever, in kind of the aftermath of the JFK assassination, you also have these other forces that are going on that are kind of, focusing on the mafia and moving forward, which ultimately leads to the adoption of the RICO Act and other things with the FBI's, actually the whole federal government's war against organized crime. So, there's some people that have written about people listening to wiretaps, and you hear some mobsters cheering the assassination, but again, you're not hearing a lot of specific chatter related to it.
I would think that they were aware of a lot of the wiretaps. Like I know Giancana's apartment was bugged as well too. And I get to this point, like, you're definitely not going to, if you're going to do a plot like that, you wouldn't be cheering about it later. It just doesn't make sense, especially if you know about how deep the FBI goes. And they're working with the government. So I think they know how creative some of these people could be.
Yeah. And look, I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence tying them. But again, to me, the most fascinating stuff are all the ties, the mafia to Jack Ruby. There tons of ties, well-documented ties with the mafia and Jack Ruby.
Please explain some.
That's please. A fact. So, he's friends with Joseph Campisi, who is part of the Dallas Mafia, which is headed by Joseph Savello at that time in the early 60s. Ruby has ties to organized crime in Chicago, where he comes from. He has ties. He meets Trafficante in Cuban prison. You see this, I'm drawing a quick blank. There's a book, Contract on America, which does a really good job of kind of.
I just spoke with David.
Oh, okay. So showing like the phone calls between Ruby and organized crime figures. So, that is something that to me is like really super fascinating. That whole, ties between Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle and Carlos Marcello and those kind of things. And kind of coming full circle to where we started this, the whole spectrum, the background of this is, yes, at this time, the CIA is heavily involved in working with the mob. So yeah, that to me is the really interesting stuff that's going on around this time.
When especially the time period, was the mob just more like, was the public more aware of the mob? Like, we know gangs today, but it's not like we don't come across them in the street. But I swear, every time I'm looking back into '63 or the '70s, it's like everybody and their cousin knew a mob guy or knew some mob figure that lived down the street and, paid on the weekends to mow the lawn or something.
Yeah, I would say the '50s to the mid '70s were the heyday, kind of the golden era of the mafia. That's when they enjoyed their most power. They infiltrated almost every aspect of American life, everything, the music industry, movie industry, gambling, loan sharking. But even on the legitimate front, they had investments in hundreds of legitimate businesses. They had political power. Um, and that was kind of their heyday. So, Las Vegas at that time, pre Howard Hughes coming in. So, yeah, to your point, that was a time where you saw those really deep connections between organized crime and, well, whether it be politicians or people in the intelligence community.
Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, Frank Sinatra.
That's crazy to me, man. I'm telling you, that just adds a whole other perspective. I listen to that guy's music and then I see his name in on the FBI website. And I'm
Oh
like, what?
yeah, he had a lot of ties. Well, quick Trafficante story. So I interviewed Nancy Regano, who was Frank Regano's wife, and it was maybe her 21st or early 20s, her birthday, and she only knew Santo Trafficante in Miami as this nice old man. Yeah, and one night, Santo Trafficante, Frank Regano take Nancy Regano to the Fountain Blue because Frank Sinatra's there and it's her birthday, and she said it was like Goodfellas where they put a special table right in front for the three of them, and Frank Sinatra comes out and sings a couple songs, and he stops and he walks down and he says, I just want to wish a happy 21st birthday to Nancy, and he kisses her and kisses Trafficante on the cheek, and she's like, yeah, I think it was at that point I realized that Trafficante was something more than just a nice old man, because he had that kind of power.
Oh, that powers. That's just, I mean, that's exciting, but scary at the same time. It's like, I mean, to make Frank Sinatra, a grown man, kiss whether it's his hand or whatever, but it's just, I mean, and he's a top mogul figure too. I know plenty of, I mean, he wasn't a bad guy. He wasn't rude or anything like that. It was actually really, really nice. There's a story about a busboy where he accidentally broke a dish and the manager, whoever, was yelling at the busboy, and Frank Sinatra overheard it, and he brought the boy over and he brought the manager over and he was like, how much are these glasses? And the guy said some price and he just kept told the busboy to grab them and throw them on the ground and break every single one. And he paid for them all, which I thought was like, that's an interesting story. But I mean, to make him, I mean, like I said, the mob ties must run deep on those aspects of things. But do you believe Jack Ruby was a low level guy?
I think if you were to look him up on a chart or put a chart together, I think he would fall under as an associate, not a made guy. He couldn't be because it wasn't Italian, but what he worked in the nightclub industry, the people he hung with, that's enough to consider him kind of a low level associate.
Now, when did Trafficante and Marcello meet?
Well, that's a good question. When did they? So there always has been a close connection between organized crime in New Orleans and Tampa, because there was kind of a close connection with some of the immigration back and forth between, these are two port cities in the Deep South that share a lot of similarities. But we really start seeing Trafficante ties with Marcello and some of his lieutenants, like his lieutenant Augustine Lazaro was very close with Joe Marcello, Carlos's brother, in the mid to late 50s. And then by the mid 60s, it's pretty clear that the Trafficantes and the Marcellos have close personal connections as well as business connections.
Now, was it more of a acquaintance or an associate relationship between all of these individuals, or were there any rivalries or family feuds between any of the, at least in Trafficante's aspects? Were there any feuds that he had going on between other rival families?
I'd read a few places where he might have had a little bit of a rivalry with Marcello from time to time, but generally it seemed to be more amicable. And I think the fact that Trafficante spent a lot of time in Miami and he worked with so many other families kind of ameliorated that situation. There wasn't like another family in Tampa that at that time. Now, earlier on, kind of jumping back a little bit, in the early 50s, there was another faction of the Tampa family, and there was a little bit of an internal war. But Tampa wasn't worried about the Boston Mafia moving down to Tampa. So you didn't have a lot of those rivalries between families, at least in terms of what Trafficante experienced.
When it comes to the public's awareness or just consciousness of the mob from the beginning to maybe when it started to kind of die down a little bit, like when they started to become older, did you notice any change in the way people were viewing them? Like if it was more of like there are some things I see with media where it's old pictures of some of these mafia guys walking down the street, and I'm like, it's weird. Like I feel like you have to have a lot of stones to do that, and it seems like they changed a more perspective where it's now they're like celebrities, like taking a picture of Lindsay Lohan on the side of the street or something.
Yeah, actually, I would think two things to that. Number one is that even from like, if you look back in the 1930s, the Al Capone to the start of talking motion pictures, the mobsters were already celebrities. And I think that just continued on in different forms of the media. Certainly look at the bookends of Al Capone and John Gotti. I mean, these were, John Gotti made the cover of Time, and Andy Warhol did a print of him. I mean, you can't get much more pop culture than that. So I think it was two things. I think it was having those gangsters with personality, and also Hollywood and television kind of using the mafia really to make some great pieces of art, but also as kind of a tool, plot device throughout many different types of media that kind of cemented that into the American psyche as, this kind of mythical figure in a way.
Now, when it comes to a lot of your research, like how many people did you interview that had ties to Trafficante?
It was really hard to find someone. When I wrote my first book, it was really hard to find someone to talk. And part of that is that the Tampa family never had like a Sammy Gravano or a big time turncoat. There were some guys that were informants and would give the cops little bits of advice, but for the most part, the inner workings, the real inner workings of the Tampa family were never exposed like they were, in some other families around the country. But in writing the Trafficante book, I definitely, once the first book came out, Cigar City Mafia, I had more people that were willing to talk to me. And, over the years, I still get people that email me, hey, I grew up this, or I knew about this or that. So, I think as I have done more research, people have seen how much, I'm just not some guy looking to get information. And I've had a lot of people tell me stuff in confidence that I'll never print or write about. Just be like, hey, I'd love to tell you this story about what happened. So that's always one of the interesting things about research, is when you find someone that has that inside information and getting their perspective of what it was like. Because, it's one thing like you or I to look outside looking in. We can get as much research as we want, but sometimes you miss that anecdotal, those little stories that really add flavor to things.
Did it ever, I mean, through your work, push the boundary of conspiracy for you? Like I would have said that the government working with the mob was a conspiracy, but then once I kind of found out about the organized crime and the relationship there, like it doesn't have to be something insane, but it just that pushes the boundary for you, like about Trafficante, something that you wouldn't ever have thought to be real, and then you come across it and you're like, okay, it is real.
Not necessarily that, only because I was aware of the CIA mafia plots before I started researching this.
Exploding seashell is nuts.
Yeah, some of that stuff, and some of that stuff, I don't necessarily know, how much of that is hyperbole or fact, but
The
for
heart attack
sure,
gun is real. That is real.
yeah, and some of those are for sure are real, and you see them used in other areas. Oh, one thing is that supposedly Trafficante had enlisted an aide to help assassinate the president of the Dominican Republic as part. This happened in the late '60s as part of this whole, when the CIA were, doing coups around the world. And there's not a excuse me, there's not a ton of information on it, and it's been written about only sporadically. But that may be something one day I'll take a deeper dive into looking at.
Now, where did you, besides interviews, did you get a lot of documents? Did you look through any letters? I mean, did you look into any of the Kennedy assassination related stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of had to, with Trafficante being so prominent. And I I didn't do I did a deep dive actually like around the time JFK came out in the early '90s. And then when I was doing Trafficante, I realized if I went too far down this path, that I would skew the rest of the stuff I really wanted to tell. So I've done some deep dives, really concentrating more on Trafficante and his connections rather than the whole thing. I've read a lot of the books and certainly follow a lot of the stuff about it. But for what I wanted to do, I and the amount of research I needed to do, I didn't have the time to just dive down this one rabbit hole. There were other ones I had to dive down to that were more like strictly related to the mafia.
Did you come across any connections between Trafficante and Tampa? Just, I mean, not like the actual city, but the police, like that. I started questioning that a little bit more, even from the JFK assassination with Dallas police and trying to look at the weird. They said they never knew Jack Ruby, yet everyone was on a first name basis with Jack. So it made me question, like, is that a good way that the mob's tactics are? I would have to think if you're going to run some of your gambling activities and you have a lot of police individuals. I'm not saying all police are bad, but I'm just saying some of them either look the other way or they had an incentive. Maybe they got a little something out of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think any city, especially the smaller cities where you see the mafia active, there's at some point, at somewhere along the line, some level of political and law enforcement corruption. And Tampa was no stranger to that. In fact, in 1950, during the Kefauver hearings, this was this roving congressional set of hearings looking at organized crime. They came to Tampa, and the sheriff of Tampa at that time, or of Hillsborough County, where Tampa's located, was very involved in taking payoffs and bribes from the mob here locally. So, yeah, I think corruption of local law enforcement, one or two guys here, a detective here, a lieutenant here, police chief here, that definitely went a long way in enabling the mafia to operate where it did.
Now, I mentioned earlier about the IQ of Giancana, but I got to ask this. Did you gain any perspective when it came to how smart a lot of these mafia guys were? Like, just strictly from a business aspect, like despite all the horrible whatever you could list, but I'm saying from getting together with the police, being able to run your activities, some of the complications, a lot of these plants, I'm like, shit, dude, trying to text on my phone and, I don't know, brush my hair at the same time is a difficult thing to do. And these people seem like they're juggling like 50 things at once.
Yeah, I think definitely in that earlier generation, you see guys that just for one reason or another, like Trafficante never finished high school. For one reason or another, didn't get the formal education, but had that intellect, had that intelligence. There was a Central Florida mob guy named Harlan Blackburn, and one of the last times he was sentenced to prison, his lawyer basically said, if the lottery was around when Harlan grew up, he would have been the great head of the state lottery. So some of these guys did have that business acumen. They just didn't have the formal education. Some of them, like Meyer Lansky, I've talked to his family, very well read, knowledgeable on a lot of subjects. And then you get the other side, the kind of not very intelligent, almost sociopaths. So it's kind of an interesting mix. But I think in order to be a successful leader in the mafia, there has to be a certain level of intelligence. And a guy like Trafficante or Marcello, who was around for many years, they were good at what they did. And what they did was just happen to be, running criminal enterprises.
When it came to some of the like Goodfellas and a couple of the other mob movies, did any of them have some, I guess, realism in it when it came to some of your work actually looking into the lives of these people?
Yeah, so I'll use Tampa specifically as an example. Goodfellas, there's a scene where the guys, Ray Liotta and Robert De Niro, go to Tampa and beat up a guy in the back of a car that owes them money, threaten to feed him to the lions. The feed him to the lions part probably didn't really happen, but it was actually based on a true event that happened in Tampa in the fall of 1970. The movie Donnie Brasco with Johnny Depp and Al Pacino, there's a scene in there that involves Santo Trafficante that actually did happen, although it happened in the Tampa area. In the movie, everything's in Miami. So there are a few of those movies, I think, where it's certainly like Donnie Brasco, that's based on a true story where they're taking real things that happen. And, it's a little Hollywoodized, but there's a few of them that have good realistic aspects.
And just to clear this up for me, when it came to I guess the gun running, was it to get guns into Cuba or get guns out of Cuba?
No, get guns into Cuba.
Okay, so I'm guessing they had to have it in at Cuba to be able to get those guns. And I mean, how are they transporting those?
That's a good question. I don't want to speak on an authority on like internally what happened, but there were a number of incidents of armories being robbed, specifically up in the Northeast, and those guns were shipped obviously via ship, and they coordinated with Cuban guerrillas on the ground who were part of Castro's army and were delivering them. I would imagine some of them were being brought overland to where some of the fortifications were of the guerrilla army.
I wonder if some of those mob individuals, like I know we talk about like the assassination plots, but I wonder if any of them were part of helping arm some of the resistance fighters.
Oh yeah, for sure. There were a few of them that guys like Norman Rothman, who was kind of a low level mob associate. I think he was out of Pittsburgh. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty positive he's out of Pittsburgh. He was associated with the Manarino brothers out of New Kensington, Pennsylvania, and he was implicated in arms going to Cuba. There's indication, and I've seen information saying that Jack Ruby might have been involved with some of these shipments of arms to Cuba. I can't recall off the top of my head where that information is. I might have probably have it in a hard copy file somewhere, but there were incidents of that going on.
Now, did you gain? I mean, I've asked you kind of your perspective on your work on Trafficante, but I mean, did you gain any? I wouldn't say I mean, I could say respect. Respect is a good word to use. I mean, I mean, not just the sophistication in it, but I feel like you're looking into his life and kind of understanding, who he was a little bit deeper than probably most people do. Even if you look at stuff with the Kennedy assassination, people just get a very rough and very untold cultured version. They kind of put him in the peg of just how most mob people are in movies or some heinous acts that mobs are. But I feel like, I mean, I talked to Stephen Kinzer, who wrote Poisoner in Chief, and hearing him talk about Sidney Gottlieb, and if you know the horrible things that guy was up to, but then you hear him talk about looking into his life and the things he did outside of work, and it's just like you can't be mad at the guy. You just kind of look at him as like a troubled soul or someone that was just kind of in a jam.
Yeah, I talked to dozens, well, probably hundreds at this point of people that remember Trafficante from around town, people who were somewhat related to him, his immediate family, not necessarily my biggest fans, but and that's understandable. Um, I'll say he was a nice old man. He was very generous. He was well liked. He had a good demeanor about him. He wasn't like a Roy DeMeo, like just a pure off sociopath. He had a certain likability to him. He was respected. He was respected by other mafia guys. So yeah, that kind of tells you that there's something else there that maybe in different circumstances, he would have been president of a company or in some of that kind of level and the legitimate business enterprise. And through whether it was because his father was a mafia boss or, that time, the career prospects for someone, Sicilian immigrant, son of a Sicilian immigrant in Ybor at that time might not have been as great as others. Who knows? It's a big game of what if, but certainly people I've spoken to that knew him, interacted with him, even law enforcement said that they were found him to be quite pleasant, to them, even though they were following him and taking his photos.
What was such a big issue with the illegal gambling? Like hearing that is just sounds so foreign today. I mean, I live like not even 5 minutes away from a casino. So it's just like seeing how the tides kind of shift in a sense, and then this illegal activity of gambling. And then, some of these people that were, saying it was illegal, they were like, oh, it's okay if I do it. So it's like, I don't know when I mean, when did like, I guess the word organized crime really kind of hit the market or hit the press where people started realizing there was this, and what was the definition of organized crime?
Oh, that's a deep question there. What is organized crime?
I asked like 10 of them.
Um, well, I'll start with that one in that I think there's the thing to remember about the mafia, which sets it apart from maybe some gangs. It's really kind of a strict hierarchical structure, and it's a process and a structure that's in place as time goes by. That doesn't change. You look at the Colombo family in New York now. Just they had a big bust, maybe not even a year ago. There's still a boss, there's still an underboss, there's still capos, there's still crews. That's the same structure it's been with some slight modifications, maybe going back 100 years. So that's an organized template, basically, of a criminal organization that moves along this path. So at least for me, that's how I can kind of look at something and say, okay, that's kind of an organized crime group, something that's, really more a cohesive structure. Illegal gambling, really people have loved to gamble since whatever prehistory probably, but certainly reading back to how far back in human history you go, there's some type of games of chance. And I think the mafia and organized criminals saw opportunities to feed into that vice. It was for the most part, looked at as a victimless vice. Um, and it was illegal for most of the 20th century. Again, look at it now. I'll go make a sports bet right now on my phone. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly you couldn't do that. You had to go to your neighborhood bar and bet with a bookie who bet with a bunch of other bookies who were part of this organized betting operation run by the mob. So the funny thing is, illegal gambling was probably one of the biggest moneymakers of the mafia, and it's probably the thing that got taken from them the most because gambling's so widely available now and legal.
You would think that gun running would be the biggest issue that they would focus on.
Yeah, really, the mafia now, a lot of it's kind of quasi-legitimate, but they're really rapidly losing their sources of illegal revenue.
I feel like now the mob is more just about kind of like a niche or a clique. It's like being in a group. I mean, there's probably still that respectable aspect of stuff, but I mean, is it the same fear that there was, back in the day, if they knew like, don't mess with that guy, he's friends with this mob person or this mob person. You also mentioned Jack Ruby wasn't Italian. Is that a thing? Like the families, like they, even if they worked with someone or they got to know someone pretty closely, they wouldn't do it if there wasn't like a certain aspect of them that was like Italian or Irish or.
No, they couldn't be made formally inducted into the mafia if they weren't Italian. And there have been some people that are half Italian, but certainly a Jewish guy like Jack Ruby can never be a made member of the mafia. They would always be outside the structure, but there were very powerful mob guys. And I'm using the mob kind of a broader kind of the mafia and their associates. And those like Meyer Lansky wasn't a mafia guy. He was a mob guy. He was not a made member of the mafia, but he was very close to a lot of mafia families, mafia bosses. So that's where these associates kind of go. And some of them are pretty powerful, like Murray Humphreys out of Chicago or Meyer Lansky. And some of them are, you never hear about them because they're just really super low level.
When it comes to relationship with Hoover, I mean, did you come across anything with writing of Trafficante and Hoover? I see the opposite end, but it's Hoover talking about Trafficante, but I don't know, this, like I said, the idea of the Hoover not acknowledging the mob. I mean, you had to, everyone knew who the mob was, but Hoover just didn't feel like it was in his place or his FBI to be able to do that. We didn't see that until around the 70s.
Yeah, no, I never saw any indication about Trafficante and any kind of even mentioning Hoover. Really, there are not a lot of wiretaps of Trafficante. It's not like Sam DeCavalcante or Giancana or Chip DiCarlo that had, there's voluminous amounts of transcripts. There really is not that much on Trafficante.
Do you think it's because they weren't worried about him?
I think it's just a function of the way the FBI were operating at that time out of Tampa versus other areas. A lot of the early wiretaps, like Giancana, those were illegal wiretaps. They weren't court authorized. And I think you saw more of that kind of focus in the New York, New Jersey, Chicago. These were the much bigger families. Not to say that the FBI weren't keeping an eye on Trafficante, but you didn't see those wide and deep investigations of Trafficante as you did up in the Northeast, just the pure size of the families. They were so much bigger up north.
It makes you question if they were worried as much about communism as they say, and as much as the documents show, because I would feel like, that port in Tampa would probably be one of the biggest examples of just the main communist kind of infiltration aspect of things. The way that they were viewing it, like people coming over, I guess they were just more paying attention to what they were sending out of Tampa into Cuba.
Yeah, I never saw a lot. I mean, the CIA had a presence in Tampa during the Cold War, and certainly the Castro. But the thing about Tampa that's way different than Miami. Miami was really the center of anti-Castro activities, and part of that is that the Cuban community in Tampa is started in the late 1800s, whereas the Cuban community in Miami really emerges post 1960. So you have a much older that's already 2 to 3 generations in, whereas the Miami Cuban community is a lot closer tied to the current goings on in Cuba at that time. So South Florida, Miami area becomes the focal point of really the federal government's kind of, keeping an eye out what's going on. And it's closer geographically by boat from Miami to Cuba than it is from Tampa to Cuba.
Did you notice, like, did Trafficante make any statements? Did he ever get political on anything?
Not that I saw. No, I think during the House Select Committee on Assassinations, when he was being interviewed, he said something like, I was, when he met with the CIA to kill Castro because he was a patriotic American. That was about as political as I ever saw him get or have come across.
Do you think, and this is going to be an aside question, but do you think that Giancana and Roselli, that you think that was Trafficante?
What do you mean?
Well, Giancana was shot to death in his apartment, and
Oh,
Roselli was
oh,
found in the
oh.
barrel.
I don't think Giancana was. I think that from all things that I've read and I've talked to guys that really are, that's their niche is Chicago. That was more internal Chicago dealings. Roselli a little bit different. So Jimmy Fradiano thinks it might have been Chicago. Other people think it might have been Trafficante. I don't know what Trafficante would have to gain from getting rid of Roselli, but he was one of the last people to see Roselli alive. So take of that what you will.
Wait, what do you mean he was the last person to see Roselli alive?
He wasn't the last, but he was one of the last. Like I think he had lunch like the day before Roselli went missing, or a day or two before. He had lunch with Roselli before Roselli went missing.
Did you ask a lot of JFK related questions when you interview people?
Depends on who I interviewed. Most of the local Tampa cops and stuff, no, because it wasn't really kind of their area where they would know anything about that. So
I see. I feel so connected right now because I feel like I'm just asking my own personal JFK related questions, but I'm glad you asked some questions on that as well too. I mean, it's like even with Marcello. Did you look into Marcello at all? Did you try and see? I know if you look into the House Select Committee on Assassinations, those are usually one of the names is Marcello, and then Trafficante are the two that Blakey believes, and a couple other individuals believe that it was the mob connection, that angle that did it. It's just so complex because you have to understand the mob relationship first. You have to understand the times. Then you also try and understand the government, what they were thinking. And it's like, they're not super far apart. They kind of think very similarly in a business aspect or a business model, but just their tactics are different. And then it's like trying to funnel that in. And it's like 60 years of hindsight you think would help, but it really doesn't.
no, sometimes it gets murkier. Yeah, so, as I mentioned earlier, that there were very close connections from a criminal business perspective between New Orleans and Tampa that it even extended past Trafficante's death. But really, Marcello and Trafficante, once they passed, I think you saw the kind of dissolution of both of those families, because those were one of the interesting things is those families were very centered on those heads. Kind of the best way to describe it in New York, like the Genovese family, Vito Genovese was boss in the late 50s, early 60s. Then the family continues on even stronger in some aspects, or maybe as strong after him. But Trafficante and Marcello were so uniquely dominant figureheads that when they pass, their families kind of start, I would say, well, falling apart, assimilating, kind of fracturing, kind of going away, basically, which is, you don't see that a lot in a lot of the mafia families.
Did Trafficante have kids?
Yes, yeah, two kids that are still in Tampa locally. Yeah,
So
and
they weren't able to
extended family.
they weren't able to keep the family together at all.
They were two daughters, so no,
Oh,
no.
oh.
But you really see in Tampa when Trafficante's era ends that none of the nephews or very few of them go into that. It's really, a lot of it. The thing about the Tampa family is law enforcement had some effect on the fortunes of the family, but really they just kind of assimilated and dissipated. It's, a lot of them went into legitimate businesses. A lot of them invested in real estate, and they didn't need to be involved in the criminal stuff anymore.
Had a different life to live. I would have to think that if you're involved in that, especially when you're a kid, I'm surprised Trafficante even, I guess it might have been just the time period. It seems like it would be easier, probably closer to the 60s, 70s, if you're born around that time, to just not follow the mob path. But in the beginning days, it probably seems like the only kind of answer in a sense.
Yeah, so you got to think he was born in 1914. So in his early teens, it's kind of towards the tail end of prohibition, illegal gambling. A game called Bolita in Ybor is wide open. It's making money. It's kind of, had he been born in the 60s, like you said, might have been a completely different story.
Well, Scott, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on the show, man. I know it wasn't 100% focused into. Hopefully, we covered some things that you
No,
obviously write
this
about
was
in your
great.
book, but
Yeah, this
I,
was
I
awesome.
I'm glad you were able to at least illuminate some things on Trafficante because, like I said, dealing with the assassination, his name gets brought up way too many times. I
Yeah,
think if
absolutely,
I
for
see that
sure.
name in Hoover, I just get a little sick to my stomach. But can you please let everybody know where your links are? If you have a Twitter, any social media profiles, Facebook, Instagram, and a website, and any book links you have as well too.
Yeah, scottdeitche.com, SCOTTDEITCHE.com. Also, if you're in the Tampa area and we do a Tampa Mafia walking tours, you can find that on tampamafia.com. And my website has all my social media handles. And again, my two books germane to Trafficante are Cigar City Mafia and The Silent Don.
Have you ever thought about looking into Al Capone?
Too many Capone books written. That's been done. It's
I
been
was gonna
done to
ask
death.
that. I was gonna
Yeah,
ask that. Yeah.
I'm more interested in the mob books and stories that haven't been told. It's the world doesn't need another Capone book.
I thought it was pretty interesting that Capone fed soup to people during like that Great Depression thing.
Yeah,
And I
but
was like,
it's funny, and I could tell you this from a mafia historical perspective. Your two most popular mobsters are Al Capone, John Gotti. Neither of them were really in power for that long, and in kind of the overall context of organized crime, really not the most powerful or successful mafia bosses. Yet they're the ones, because of their cultivation of the public imagery and the public imagination, like you just said, serving soup during the Great Depression in soup kitchens. That kind of builds up that mythology of them. It's just kind of interesting.
I think especially with bootleggers, there's a I don't see them being stigmatized as much. I know the government tried to make them seem like outlaws that were doing illegal activities, but they were, I mean, you're bringing a jar of moonshine to people. I don't see
Yeah,
how
exactly.
any
I agree. Yep.
any of those people are definitely not talking trash on you.
No,
But Scott, I'm gonna link all your links in the description, man. Like I said, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.